My hands traced the cold, splintered wood of the floorboards. The scent of cheap wrought wine and expensive jasmine perfume aggressively mixed in the suffocating air of the ruined temple. I was completely blind, yet I could clearly see the sharp, aggressive red outline of a poisoned dagger hidden in the sleeve of the woman sitting 3 feet away from me. Her name was Elara. At least, that was the name the jeering guards had called her when they shoved her into this decaying shrine 3 hours ago, loudly declaring her the first wife of the blind rat. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, mimicking the rhythmic, pathetic wheezing of the body's previous owner, a beggar who had quietly died of hypothermia just 12 hours prior. When my consciousness slammed into this broken vessel, the darkness had been absolute, but the panic only lasted for 4 seconds. My past life as a hostage negotiator had trained me to categorize trauma instantly. Blindness was a severe physical handicap, but the glowing, 3-dimensional blueprints of hostile intent that suddenly painted my mind's eye? That was an overwhelming tactical advantage. "You're awake," a voice sliced through the damp air. It was sharp, aristocratic, and completely devoid of warmth. In my mind, a pulse of cool blue light rippled out from her position. Calm. Controlled. Deadly. I groaned, playing the part. I shifted my weight, reaching out a trembling hand as if blindly searching for my bearings. My fingers brushed against a cracked clay cup near my knee. I intended to grab it to play the thirsty, confused victim, but my depth perception for objects lacking intent or danger was entirely non-existent. My hand slammed into the side of the cup instead. It tipped over with a hollow clatter, spilling stale water over the frozen floorboards. Elara exhaled, a harsh, dismissive sound. The blue light around her flickered with a brief wave of pale yellow disgust. I used the moment of her distraction to slide back, letting the spilled water mask the subtle scraping of my boots against the wood. I adjusted my angle, moving my torso exactly 3 inches to the left. I had seen a faint, jagged crimson line running across the floorboards directly beneath where I had just been sitting. A pressure plate. A trap. Rotted wood waiting to collapse into a spiked cellar below. "Don't crawl toward me, beggar," Elara commanded, her tone dropping an octave. I stopped. "Where are we?" I asked, forcing a tremor into my voice. "Fox Alley. Your grave and temporarily, my prison." Her heart rate remained perfectly steady. But as she spoke the word grave, a distinct physical sound reached my ears. Click-click, the hard edge of her thumbnail snapping against her index finger. It was rhythmic, almost subconscious. My hidden sight flared. A burst of deep orange bloomed in her chest. A lie. She wasn't planning on dying here. And she didn't believe this was her permanent prison. I thought the worst part was waking up blind in a freezing slum. I was wrong. The worst part was realizing I had been dumped into the middle of a political execution, and the executioner was sharing my room. The aristocrats of the sleepless capital hadn't just thrown a highborn woman to a blind beggar for a sick joke. They had placed 6 of them in my care. 5 more were supposedly arriving by dawn. None of this made sense. There was an equation here, and I was the missing variable they were trying to erase. "I have nothing to offer you," I rasped, leaning against the damp stone wall behind me. "I can't even see your face." "Good," she replied, the click-click of her thumbnail stopping. "Then you won't see me leave when the time comes. Stay in your corner. If you cross the center beam of this room, I will cut your throat." A straightforward threat. The aura around her turned solid red. She meant it. I nodded slowly, wrapping my ragged cloak tighter around my shoulders. I fell silent, adopting the posture of a beaten dog. But beneath the rags, my muscles were coiled. I began mapping the room using the ambient noise. The wind whistling through the cracked roof tiles. The distant, muffled screams from the deeper parts of the slum. The dripping water from the ruined altar. Minutes stretched into a heavy, agonizing hour. The silence in the temple was thick enough to choke on. Then the ambient noise shifted. The wind didn't stop, but a subtle obstruction broke the airflow coming through the front archway. Someone was standing outside. Elara's aura exploded. The calm blue vanished, replaced by a blinding, volatile mix of violet and crimson. Fear and absolute lethal intent. I heard the soft whisper of steel sliding against leather as she drew the dagger from her sleeve. But she didn't turn toward me. She shifted her weight, facing the entrance. I looked at the floorboards between her and the doorway. The jagged crimson line of the pressure plate I had avoided earlier was now pulsing violently in my mind. It wasn't a trap left by previous occupants. She had said it. I didn't know it yet, but she had already decided. The thought echoed in my mind. She wasn't just a disgraced noblewoman. She was bait. Heavy, wet footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Not one person. 3. Elara's breathing hitched, just a fraction. Whoever you are praying to, I whispered into the darkness, my voice suddenly losing all its tremors, hitting the cold air with dead, flat precision. You might want to pray fast. They brought a firecaster. Elara spun toward me, the sudden motion tearing a gasp from her throat. Outside, a violent whoosh of igniting oil drowned out the wind, and the wooden doors of the temple began to glow with a blistering, unnatural heat. The heat hit us before the flames did. It was a suffocating, physical wall that instantly evaporated the damp chill of the temple. In my mind's eye, the doorway was no longer just an exit. It was a blinding, roaring sun. The firecaster outside was channeling an intense amount of thermal energy. I could see his intent, a chaotic, swirling mass of bright orange and violent red bleeding through the rotting wood of the doors. He wasn't trying to flush us out. He was trying to incinerate the building with us inside. Get up! Elara screamed. Her aristocratic composure had entirely shattered. The cool blue aura that had surrounded her just 2 minutes ago was gone, replaced by the jagged violet spikes of pure panic. She coughed violently as thick, oily black smoke began banking down from the ceiling, dropping to exactly 4 feet above the floorboards. Your trap, I coughed, keeping my face pressed against the cold wood, playing the pathetic beggar perfectly. It won't work if they don't step inside. Shut up and move. She snapped, grabbing the collar of my ragged tunic. She hauled me upward with surprising strength for someone of her build. The heavy wooden doors finally gave way with a deafening crack. A torrential wave of orange fire rolled into the room, instantly igniting the dry tapestries hanging near the altar. The temperature spiked by at least 40 degrees in 3 seconds. Outside, a deep, resonant laugh echoed over the roar of the flames. In my hidden sight, the 2 dull red markers the accompanying thugs stood 10 feet back, weapons drawn, waiting to butcher us if we somehow ran through the inferno. We had roughly 30 seconds before the oxygen in the room was entirely consumed. Elara dragged me toward the rear wall, her dagger still gripped tightly in her right hand. But there was no exit. Just solid, unyielding stone. Her breathing grew shallow, ragged. The distinct click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger started up again, rapid and frantic. She was calculating her odds of running through the fire versus suffocating here. Both equations ended in 0. I didn't know it yet, but she had already decided to use my body as a shield to breach the doorway. I saw her intent shift, a cold, calculated spike of pale yellow locking onto my torso. I couldn't let her do that. The floor, I gasped, intentionally stumbling forward and tearing out of her grip. I dropped to my hands and knees, scrambling wildly like a terrified animal. What are you doing? Get back here, she yelled, her voice cracking from the smoke. I ignored her. I crawled directly toward the center of the room. My mind's eye was locked onto the jagged crimson outline of the pressure plate she had rigged earlier. It was a deadfall trap, 7 feet wide, 4 feet across. The wood was scored underneath, designed to break under 50 pounds of pressure. Below it was a cellar, and based on the faint, rusted auras projecting upward, it was lined with iron spikes. It was a death trap, but right now it was our only shield from the fire. There's a draft. I lied, my voice panicked, frantic. Air. Under the boards. I reached the edge of the crimson rectangle. Above us, the main support beam of the temple groaned, the wood snapping under the intense heat. A shower of burning embers rained down, singeing the back of my neck. You fool, stop. Elara lunged after me. She realized what I was doing. She knew exactly where the pressure plate was, but the smoke was too thick, her eyes streaming with tears. She misjudged the distance. As her hand clamped onto my shoulder, I shifted my weight. I deliberately slammed my knee directly into the weakest point of the crimson line. Crack. The floorboards gave way with a sickening crunch. Gravity seized us. We fell. It was a 12-foot drop. In the absolute pitch black of the cellar, a normal man would have flailed, panicked, and impaled himself. But my sight was perfectly clear. I saw the 6 rusted iron spikes protruding from the compacted dirt floor. They glowed with a dull, lifeless gray, dangerous, but immobile. In midair, I twisted my torso, wrapping my arms around Elara and pulling her over me. I used her momentum to spin us exactly 2 feet to the left. I hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the air from my lungs in a violent rush. My shoulder slammed into the dirt, barely 3 inches from the nearest iron spike. Elara crashed on top of me, her weight driving me deeper into the mud. Above us, the rest of the weekend floor collapsed. A massive, burning section of the roof caved in, slamming into the hole we had just fallen through. A cascade of dirt and burning debris rained down, completely sealing the opening. Then total darkness. The roaring of the fire above became a muffled, distant rumble. The air down here was cold, smelling of wet earth, iron, and centuries of rot. I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing, suppressing the sharp pain radiating from my bruised ribs. Elara rolled off me, gasping for air. Her dagger scraped against the dirt as she pushed herself up against a stone pillar. She wheezed, her voice trembling. The blue aura of her composure was trying to reassemble itself, but the edges were frayed with shock. You threw us into the spike pit. I tripped, I rasped, rubbing my head as if dazed. The floor broke. I couldn't see. We missed the spikes by inches, she whispered, the realization hitting her. I could hear her heart rate slowing down, replacing panic with deep, calculating suspicion. We are alive, I said simply. I thought the worst part was surviving the fall. I was wrong. As I sat up, brushing the damp earth from my rags, I let my hidden sight expand to map the rest of the sealed cellar. It wasn't just a pit, it was a tunnel. It stretched back into the earth, leading deeper beneath Fox Alley. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Exactly 15 feet down the tunnel, sitting perfectly still in the darkness, was a solid, glowing pulse of emerald green intent. It was a person. They weren't moving. Their heart rate was incredibly slow, almost meditative. And based on the cool, unbothered nature of the green aura, they had been sitting there watching us fall, completely unaffected by the fire above. Elara, I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the empty blackness. Don't move. Before she could ask why, a soft, amused voice drifted out from the absolute dark. That was a very clever trick, Beggar. But you bled on my rug. I kept my left hand pressed flat against the freezing dirt floor, tasting the thick copper of my own bitten tongue while a perfectly cultured voice echoed in the pitch-black tunnel. You're bleeding on my rug, the voice repeated, the tone entirely conversational. In my hidden sight, the emerald green aura of the stranger sitting exactly 15 feet away didn't flicker. A normal person sitting in the dark beneath a burning building would radiate jagged spikes of violet terror or crimson adrenaline. This woman was a placid pool of deep green. She wasn't just calm, she was profoundly bored. Beside me, Elara's aura erupted into a violent, chaotic red. The click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger started instantly, frantic and sharp. I heard the rustle of her ruined silk dress as she shifted her weight, preparing to lunge blindly into the dark with her dagger. I couldn't let her do that. A blind attack against a completely calm target in an unknown environment was statistical suicide. I lashed out with my right hand, grasping exactly 2 inches above Elara's ankle. I squeezed, pinning her leg to the dirt. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath. Let go of me, you worthless SHH, I breathed, turning my face toward the empty blackness. I modulated my vocal cords to sound raw, pathetic, but desperately pleading. Who is there? Please. The floor broke. We can't see. A soft, amused exhale drifted from the green aura. The floor didn't break. Beggar, the voice replied. You broke it. A highly specific application of weight on the structural weak point of a deadfall trap. 50 pounds of pressure, applied directly over the rusted hinge. Very lucky for a blind man. My heart rate remained steady, but internally, my analytical engine stalled for a fraction of a second. She hadn't just watched us fall. She had measured the physics of the fall. I thought the fire above was the trap. I was wrong. The fire was just the herding dog. This tunnel was the cage, and this woman was the warden. A sharp scraping sound echoed through the damp air. A single match flared into existence. Even with blind eyes, my retinas perceived a faint difference in temperature, a tiny prick of heat exactly where the green aura sat. "Let there be light," she murmured. Through the faint shifting of the air and the acoustic bounds of the tunnel walls, I began to map the space. It wasn't a dirt tunnel. It was a subterranean stone vault, roughly 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, and sitting directly in the center of it, illuminated by the flickering yellow glow of a glass oil lantern she had just lit, was a woman. "Vesper," Elara whispered, the poison in her voice thick enough to cut. Her violet aura of fear shifted entirely into a dark, pulsing orange of pure hatred. "You rat. You arranged this." "I arranged nothing," Elara, Vesper replied. The sound of a heavy, leather-bound book snapping shut echoed off the stone walls. "I merely arrived 24 hours before you did. The guards told me to wait here. They said the first wife would be dropping in shortly. I didn't expect you to take it quite so literally." I maintained my position on the floor, my breathing shallow, acting as the helpless bystander caught between two warring aristocrats. But my mind was actively scanning. I pushed my echolocation of intent outward, trying to gauge the structural integrity of the vault walls and locate an exit. It was my first mistake of the night. I attempted to map the air currents to find a draft, assuming a tunnel this deep must have ventilation. But the raging inferno in the temple 12 feet above us was consuming oxygen at a terrifying rate. It created a pressure vacuum. The air in the vault didn't flow out. It violently cycled inward, creating a vortex of confusing thermal signatures that blinded my secondary sense. I felt a sudden, sharp wave of vertigo, my internal map shattering into static. I squeezed my eyes shut, and during the nausea, I had to adapt. Stop looking for air. Look for cold. I dragged my fingertips across the dirt floor. 3 inches deep. Beneath the dirt was solid, freezing granite. I mapped the granite outward. Left wall, solid. Right wall, solid. Back wall, directly behind Vesper. A massive pocket of absolute freezing emptiness. An iron door. And it was thick. "You knew they were burning the temple," Elara accused, struggling against my grip on her ankle. She kicked free, scrambling to her feet, her dagger leveled at Vesper's lantern. "You sat down here and waited for us to burn. If I wanted you to burn, I wouldn't have cushioned the floor around the spiked pit with 3 layers of stolen wool," Vesper countered smoothly. Her green aura pulsed with a faint ripple of annoyance. "Look down, Elara." "You're standing on it." Elara froze. The violent red of her intent wavered. I didn't need to look. I could feel the dense, matted fabric beneath my knees. It was the only reason my ribs weren't completely shattered. "Why?" Elara demanded, her voice losing its absolute certainty. "Because dead women have no value in an equation," Vesper said, standing up. The rustle of heavy velvet accompanied her movement. "And currently, we are part of a very complex, very lethal mathematical problem." That was the moment the true hierarchy of the dark was established. Elara was a weapon. Vesper was the strategist. And I was the variable they both thought was a 0. 6, I rasped, forcing my voice to tremble as I slowly pushed myself up into a kneeling position. I kept my unseeing eyes aimed roughly at Vesper's chest. "They the guards up there. They said there were 6 wives." Vesper paused. For the first time, her green aura spiked with a sharp, brilliant flash of silver genuine surprise. It wasn't because of what I said, but because I had spoken at all. "The beggar can count," Vesper noted, picking up her lantern. She took 3 steps toward us. Her boots were soft-soled leather, silent on the stone, but I tracked the heat of her approach perfectly. "Yes." 6. The ruling families of the sleepless capital didn't just throw their unwanted daughters away. They bundled us together. A sacrifice to the KH letter 1EBF, letter 1B0, letter 1EDBCHUY, letter 1EBFT, letter 1EC7, the blood tier pact. She stopped exactly 5 feet away from me. I could smell the faint scent of old paper and bitter almonds clinging to her clothes. "But that isn't the problem right now," Vesper continued, her voice dropping a fraction. She raised the lantern slightly, casting long, wavering shadows against the far wall of the vault. "Look behind me, Elara." I didn't need the light. My adapted sight had finally pierced the thermal interference. I tracked the cold granite floor behind Vesper. I felt the shape of the iron door. But now, I saw what was arranged directly in front of it. 5 heavy, high-backed wooden chairs, lined up in a perfect, symmetrical row. They set up a waiting room, Elara whispered, the breath leaving her lungs. They did, Vesper agreed quietly. And I have been sitting in one of those chairs for 24 hours. Which means I know exactly what this room sounds like when it is empty. Vesper's emerald aura suddenly contracted, condensing into a tight, hardened knot of pale gray caution. And for the last 40 seconds, Vesper said, her eyes locked on the heavy iron door at the back of the vault, something on the other side of that door has been breathing. I focused my intent on the massive pocket of freezing cold behind the iron. She was right. It wasn't a draft. It was a massive, rhythmic exhalation of heat. And it was slowly, deliberately pressing its weight against the rusted metal of the lock. The iron groaned. It wasn't a metallic creak. It was a deep, structural scream of 2-inch thick metal being pushed beyond its tensile limit. I kept my head tilted slightly downward, aiming my useless eyes at the dirt while my mind mapped the catastrophic kinetic energy building behind the back wall of the vault. The entity on the other side wasn't using a battering ram. It was using its own body. Through the freezing pocket of the iron door, I saw a massive, swirling cyclone of boiling crimson. Pure, chemically induced rage. The heart rate was impossible, pounding at over 180 beats per minute, sustaining a rhythm that would cause a normal human heart to tear itself apart. Thud. The vibrations traveled through the granite floor, up through the layers of stolen wool, and straight into my bruised ribs. Dust and loose mortar rained down from the arched ceiling. Vesper, Elara's voice was a tight, panicked hiss. The rapid click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger was deafening in the enclosed space. What is that? A complication, Vesper replied. Her emerald aura had entirely vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive shell of slate gray. She didn't retreat, but her right hand slipped smoothly into the folds of her heavy velvet skirt. The subtle shift in her posture, dropping her center of gravity by 2 inches, told me she was armed, and unlike Elara, she actually knew how to plant her feet for a kill. The Blood Tier Pact dictates we must survive 100 days. It never specified that the first day would be a passive quarantine. Thud. The upper right hinge of the iron door snapped. A sharp, echoing crack whipped through the vault. I didn't know it yet, but the ruling families hadn't just sent us here to die of exposure. The thought finalized in my analytical engine. They had sent a cleaner. Someone to ensure the wives didn't survive long enough to become a political liability. Get back, Vesper commanded, her cultured tone finally cracking, revealing a sharp, icy authority. She raised the glass oil lantern higher, casting the heavy shadows of the 5 empty chairs against the struggling iron. Elara didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled backward, her violet aura of terror practically vibrating. She pressed herself against the cold granite wall to my left, her dagger trembling in front of her. I stayed on my knees. I was calculating the structural failure of the remaining 2 hinges. The bottom hinge was rusted, flaking iron oxide into the air with every impact. The middle hinge was bearing the entirety of the door's weight. Given the velocity of the impacts and the mass of the thermal signature behind it, the door wasn't just going to open. It was going to become a 200-pound projectile. And Vesper was standing exactly 4 feet directly in its trajectory. Thud. The bottom hinge gave way. The massive iron slab tilted inward, held only by the buckling center joint. Vesper's gray aura flared with a sudden spike of alarm as she finally realized the physics of her positioning. She tried to step back, but her heavy velvet skirt caught on the jagged edge of one of the heavy wooden chairs. She was stuck. She had exactly 1.5 seconds before the center hinge failed. I couldn't let the strategist die on day 1. I needed her brain alive to map the wider political landscape of this execution. I moved. I didn't leap like a trained soldier. I scrambled like a terrified, blind animal trying to crawl away from the noise. I threw my weight forward, wildly swinging my arms as if completely disoriented by the echoing slams. My left shoulder slammed directly into the wooden chair snagging Vesper's skirt. The impact shattered the dry, brittle wood of the chair's front leg. The chair collapsed sideways. My momentum carried me forward, my back colliding heavily with Vesper's knees, knocking her off balance. She fell backward, dropping the lantern. It shattered on the granite, plunging the vault into near total darkness, illuminated only by a small, dying pool of burning oil. A fraction of a second later, the center hinge exploded. The 2-inch thick iron door blew inward with the force of a cannon strike. It sheared through the air exactly where Vesper's torso had been a moment prior, smashing into the remaining wooden chairs and obliterating them into jagged splinters. The deafening crash of metal against stone left a ringing in my ears. The dying oil fire cast long, chaotic shadows, but my hidden sight was completely unbothered by the darkness. Standing in the breached doorway was a mountain of augmented muscle. He was at least 6'6", stripped to the waist, his skin heavily scarred and glistening with sweat. But what painted my mind's eye was the violent, boiling crimson of his intent. He was under the influence of Grave-Spore, a highly toxic combat stimulant I had only read about in the fragmented memories of my body's previous owner. It killed pain, boosted adrenaline, and erased higher cognitive function, leaving only target acquisition. Elara let out a choked sob, pressing herself harder against the wall. Vesper groaned, untangling herself from my rags and the broken chair. Her gray aura was chaotic, flashing with shock. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the dying orange flames of the oil spill. She knew my clumsy scramble had just saved her life, but she couldn't process how a blind man had timed it so perfectly. The berserker stepped into the vault. His breathing was wet and ragged. His massive head turned. He didn't look at Elara, trembling against the wall. He didn't look at Vesper, who was quickly drawing a slim, silver stiletto from her skirt. His boiling crimson aura locked entirely onto me. Everything that happened next was because of the anomaly I presented. The Grave-Spore stimulant didn't just induce rage, it tracked pheromones and fear. Elara reeked of terror. Vesper smelled of cold adrenaline. But I projected absolutely nothing. My heart rate was resting at a perfectly calm 62 beats per minute. To a chemically crazed predator hunting fear, a completely calm variable in a room full of panic wasn't just confusing. It was a primary threat. The berserker let out a guttural, wet roar and charged directly at the blind beggar on the floor. The smell of stale sweat, raw copper, and boiling adrenaline hit me a split second before the physical impact. A Grave-Spore addict did not fight with martial discipline. They fought with the pure, uninhibited kinetic energy of a falling boulder. In my mind's eye, the boiling crimson aura of the massive man eclipsed the entire room. His heart was hammering at exactly 192 beats per minute. The air around him practically vibrated with thermal heat. I had no time to stand. I threw my weight to the left, attempting a chaotic, uncoordinated roll. It was a severe miscalculation. I had mapped his forward velocity perfectly, but I failed to account for the sheer wingspan of his arms. His right boot clipped my shin, and his massive hand blindly swept through the darkness, catching the heavy wool of my ragged cloak. With a guttural roar, he ripped me straight off the cold granite floor. Gravity inverted. For a single, terrifying second, I was airborne. Then my back slammed into the solid stone wall of the vault. The impact drove every ounce of oxygen from my lungs. A sharp, localized pain exploded in my lower left ribs. 2 cracked, at least. I collapsed into a pathetic heap on the freezing floor, tasting a fresh wave of iron in my mouth. Kaelen, my internal analytical engine rebooted instantly, forcefully suppressing the pain. You cannot fight him. You are blind. Act blind. The berserker turned, his heavy boots crunching over the shattered remnants of the wooden chairs. His crimson intent locked onto my crumpled form again. The Grave-Spore in his bloodstream was completely overriding his visual cortex. He was hunting purely by the absence of fear pheromones. My calm was acting as a flawless beacon in the dark. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, gasping loudly, dragging my heels against the stone as if trying to scurry backward. To my right, Vesper had not moved to help me. Her slate-gray aura of absolute caution remained perfectly still. I heard the faint, metallic whisper of her silver stiletto rotating between her fingers, a slow, rhythmic, almost meditative motion. She was watching me. She was analyzing the anomaly of my survival. If I suddenly displayed elite tactical grappling, I would survive the next 10 seconds, but Vesper would instantly classify me as a lethal, highly trained asset. I would become her primary target. I needed to neutralize a 250-pound killing machine using nothing but the environment, and it had to look entirely like the blind luck of a desperate beggar. The berserker charged again. I expanded my echolocation of intent to its absolute maximum limit, mapping the microterrain of the vault floor between us. 10 feet. 8 feet. Directly in his path lay the spilled, dying puddle of lantern oil on the slick granite. 2 feet beyond that, jetting upward at a vicious 45-degree angle, was the sheared, jagged bottom hinge of the massive iron door, still bolted firmly into the stone frame. I didn't try to dodge. I didn't try to stand. I threw my arms over my face and screamed, a raw, terrified sound that echoed harshly off the vaulted ceiling. No, please. Simultaneously, I deliberately kicked my right leg out, aiming my heavy beggar's boot directly at the largest chunk of splintered oak from the destroyed chair. I didn't hit the berserker. I hit the wood, sending it sliding rapidly across the slick granite, directly into the oil puddle. At exactly 192 beats per minute, the human brain under Grave-Spore cannot process sudden changes in floor friction. The berserker's heavy leather boot planted precisely onto the oil-slicked piece of oak. His forward momentum and unstoppable, chemically fueled force instantly betrayed him. The wood shot forward like ice. His supporting leg completely vanished from beneath him. Because his arms were raised to crush my skull, his center of gravity was entirely top-heavy. He pitched forward, falling with the full, uncontested weight of a collapsing building. The sound was not loud. It was a dense, sickening thud of heavy meat meeting unyielding metal. His boiling crimson aura flared in my mind into a blinding, chaotic white, then instantly began to hemorrhage heat. I curled into a tighter ball, keeping my arms over my head, sobbing dramatically into my ragged sleeves. I waited exactly 12 seconds. The frantic drumming of his heart rate dropped from 190 to 80, then 40, then 0. The crimson aura evaporated, leaving only the cold, lifeless gray of the environment. The vault plunged into a suffocating, heavy silence, broken only by the distant, muffled crackle of the fire burning in the temple above us. Elara's voice broke the quiet. It was a tiny, fragile whisper from the far corner. The distinct click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger was completely absent. She was too terrified to even manifest her nervous habit. I didn't answer. I kept my face pressed against my knees, feigning shock. To my right, Vesper finally moved. Her soft-soled boots made no sound, but her aura shifting from slate gray to a profound, icy blue glided smoothly across the vault. "He is dead," Vesper stated flatly. She stopped beside the massive corpse. I watched her through the ambient temperature. She was kneeling near his head. The Grave-Spore addict had impaled himself perfectly through the trachea on the jagged, rusted iron hinge protruding from the doorframe. It was a catastrophic, instantly fatal wound. "A tragic accident," Vesper murmured. The tone of her voice was completely devoid of belief. She knew. She didn't know how I had calculated the friction, the angle, and the timing without eyes, but she knew the dead man at her feet was not the victim of a clumsy beggar's luck. I thought the worst part was the physical impact of the fight. I was wrong. The worst part was what Vesper found next. I heard the sharp scrape of a match. A tiny sphere of yellow heat bloomed near the corpse's neck as Vesper lit a secondary wick she had extracted from her velvet coat. She held the tiny flame close to the dead man's collarbone. "Elara," Vesper's voice lost its aristocratic smoothness. It became tight, cold, and entirely lethal. "What?" Elara whimpered, finally peeling herself away from the wall. "Step away from the beggar," Vesper commanded, standing up slowly. The icy blue of her aura sharpened into a terrifying, focused spear of intent aimed directly at the other woman. I stayed on the floor, mapping the sudden, violent shift in the room's dynamic. "Why?" Lara demanded, her voice shaking. "Because our executioner wasn't sent by the High Council," Vesper replied, the match light flickering across the corpse. "He is branded. Right below the clavicle. A silver serpent wrapping around a blooming nightshade." Elara's breath hitched violently. In my mind, her aura exploded into a frantic, sickly yellow absolute, undeniable guilt. "That is the crest of House Vance," Vesper said, her stiletto catching the faint light. "Your family, Elara. Your family sent this dog to slaughter us." Everything that happened next was because of the silver serpent branded into that dead man's flesh. Elara stared at the corpse, her breathing shallow and erratic. In my hidden sight, her aura was a violently churning storm of sickly yellow and bruised purple, absolute denial warring with terrifying realization. The rapid, frantic click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger echoed in the heavy silence of the vault. "My father wouldn't," she whispered, her voice cracking. She took a step back, her expensive silk dress brushing against the rough granite wall. I was exiled. Banished. That was the punishment. They wouldn't waste a Grave-Spore addict on a disgraced daughter. "Your father is a pragmatist," Elara, Vesper replied, her voice dropping to a smooth, chilling monotone. She stood up, extinguishing the match with a sharp flick of her wrist. The room plunged back into the dim, dying orange glow of the spilled oil fire. The blood tier pact guarantees that if any of us survive for 100 days, we are granted a seat at the High Council's table. Why leave a volatile, angry daughter alive to potentially return and claim a seat alongside the men who threw her away? Elara opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. The yellow aura of denial faded, swallowed entirely by a deep, hollow blue of profound betrayal. I remained on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, maintaining the facade of a traumatized beggar. Internally, my analytical engine was processing Vesper's words at a blistering speed. The sleepless capital hadn't just dumped these women here to die of exposure or starvation. The ruling families were actively pruning their family trees, using Fox Alley as an untraceable execution ground. And I was chained to 6 of their targets. Above us, the massive stone archway of the vault let out a deafening, structural groan. A heavy shower of dust and mortar rained down, coating my shoulders in grit. The raging inferno in the temple above was superheating the granite ceiling. The stone was expanding, cracking under the immense thermal pressure. We had less than 5 minutes before the entire roof caved in, crushing us under tons of burning debris. "We cannot stay here," Vesper stated, stepping over the massive arm of the dead assassin. Her slate-gray aura of absolute caution had returned. She analyzed the walls, her eyes scanning the darkness that my mind had already mapped perfectly. "The door is breached, but the tunnel beyond it is likely structurally compromised. The heat is drawing all the oxygen upward." She was right. The air was growing noticeably thinner, tasting of ash and stale copper. My lungs burned with every shallow breath. I pushed my echolocation of intent outward, ignoring the erratic auras of the 2 women and the rapidly fading thermal signature of the corpse. I needed to find a structural anomaly. Solid granite absorbed heat evenly. A hollow space behind the stone would create a thermal differential, a cold spot. I scanned the left wall. Solid. I scanned the area behind the smashed iron door. Collapsing. I swept my focus to the right corner, beneath a heavy accumulation of rotting wood and compacted dirt. There it was. A perfectly rectangular pocket of absolute freezing air, measuring exactly 3 feet by 3 feet, set flush into the floor. A smuggler's drop. Now, I just had to guide them to it without revealing that I could see through solid earth. I let out a ragged, panicked cough, rolling onto my side and threshing weakly against the floor. "Air," I rasped, my voice thick with inhaled dust. I began dragging myself toward the right corner, my hands scrabbling wildly over the cold stone. I deliberately slammed my shoulder into a broken piece of a chair leg, letting out a sharp cry of pain to sell the performance. "Beggar, stop moving, you'll asphyxiate faster," Vesper ordered, though she didn't step forward to help me. "It's cold," I gasped, ignoring her. I reached the corner and began desperately clawing at the thick layer of dirt and rotten wood. My raw fingers found the edge of what felt like rusted iron. "Here! It pulls!" Vesper's aura spiked with a sudden, sharp flash of icy blue. It wasn't surprise this time. It was profound, calculating suspicion. I felt her eyes lock onto the back of my head. The probability of a blind, panicked man accidentally finding the exact structural weak point to survive a deadfall trap was astronomical. Finding a hidden airflow beneath a foot of dirt in a pitch-black vault a second time? That wasn't luck. That was a pattern. But survival took precedence over interrogation. She glided across the floor, her soft-soled boots making no sound. She knelt beside me, her heavy velvet skirt brushing my arm. She didn't speak. She simply reached out, her fingers brushing the dirt where I was digging. "Elara," Vesper called out, her voice devoid of panic, but laced with absolute command. Bring your dagger. Elara, still paralyzed by the realization of her family's betrayal, jolted. She stumbled over, the click-click of her thumb starting up again. Wedge it under the lip of the iron, Vesper instructed, pointing to the edge I had uncovered. Working together in the dim, dying light, the two aristocrats used the forged steel of the dagger to pry at the rusted grate. It shrieked in protest, the sound agonizingly loud against the grinding rumble of the failing ceiling above us. With a final, violent heave, the grate tore free, flipping backward onto the stone. A rush of cold, damp air instantly blasted upward, carrying the distinct scent of raw sewage and deep, subterranean moss. It was a vertical shaft, descending into absolute blackness. Rusted iron rungs were embedded into the stone side. I will go first, Vesper said immediately. She didn't wait for a response. She swung her legs over the edge, her slate-gray aura descending smoothly into the freezing void. The rungs are stable. Elara, follow me. Leave the beggar for last. It was a brutally practical decision. If the rungs failed, the least valuable asset would fall on the other two. If something was waiting at the bottom, I would be the rear guard. Elara didn't argue. She sheathed her dagger and practically threw herself into the hole, desperate to escape the tomb and the corpse of the men sent by her father. Another massive chunk of granite dislodged from the ceiling, smashing into the floor exactly where I had been kneeling 5 minutes ago. The vault was finished. I grabbed the first rusted iron rung and swung myself into the narrow, freezing shaft. The descent was claustrophobic, the stone walls pressing tightly against my back and chest. I moved quickly, my hidden sight tracking the cool blue and chaotic violet auras of the women roughly 15 feet below me. The shaft ended abruptly, dropping us into a narrow, arched stone corridor. The air down here was frigid and completely still. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, echoing down an endless, pitch-black tunnel. I hit the ground softly, keeping my posture hunched and my breathing ragged. We are underneath the main aqueduct, Vesper murmured, her voice bouncing strangely off the curved walls. I could hear the faint whisper of her silver stiletto spinning between her fingers again. It leads out of Fox Alley, directly toward the lower districts of the capital. Then we can leave, Elara said, her voice shaking with desperate hope. We can escape the KH, letter 1EBF, letter 1B0, letter 1EDBCHUY, letter 1EBFT, L, letter 1EC7. No, I thought, mapping the ambient temperature of the corridor ahead. We can't. I looked exactly 20 feet down the dark tunnel. My heart rate, normally a steady 62 beats per minute, skipped a single, involuntary beat. Vesper and Elara couldn't see it in the pitch black, but my mind's eye was painted with a glowing, residual smear of thermal energy against the right-hand wall. It was a handprint. The edges were still violently sharp, bleeding a bright, aggressive orange into the freezing air. It hadn't been there for days or hours. Based on the rate of thermal decay against the wet stone, the hand had been pressed against the wall exactly 3 minutes ago. While we were fighting the berserker in the vault, someone else had been standing down here in the dark, perfectly still, listening to every word. And their aura wasn't fading. It was moving deeper into the tunnel, leading us perfectly into whatever trap they had prepared next. My raw fingertips hovered exactly 2 inches from the freezing, moss-covered granite of the aqueduct wall, feeling a heat that shouldn't exist. The handprint was bleeding a vibrant, aggressive orange into my hidden sight, measuring roughly 6 inches from the heel of the palm to the fingertips. A woman's hand, and based on the rapid thermal decay of the damp stone, she was no more than 40 feet ahead of us in the pitch-black tunnel. Vesper glided past the invisible print, completely oblivious. Her slate-gray aura of absolute caution preceded her, but caution was useless against a threat you couldn't perceive. Behind me, Elara stumbled through the 2 inches of stagnant water pooling on the tunnel floor, her breathing ragged, the rapid click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger are echoing loudly off the curved ceiling. If we maintained this pace, we were going to walk directly into an ambush. I pushed my echolocation of intent to its absolute limit, letting my perception bleed down the corridor. The stalker's aura was a tight, controlled knot of pale yellow. She was waiting, but she wasn't standing in the open. She was perched high up, exactly 35 feet away, where the tunnel ceiling flared into a wider junction. And directly beneath her, Submerged under the dirty water ran a horizontal line of freezing, compressed iron, a tripwire. It was wired to a massive block of dense, structural cold lodged in the masonry above our heads. A drop gate. I didn't know it yet, but the stalker hadn't set the trap. She was just using it. The realization clicked into place. This tunnel system was rigged from a previous era, and whoever was up ahead was simply waiting for us to trigger it so she could pick through our remains. I had to trigger the mechanism prematurely, but I couldn't simply warn Vesper without revealing my tactical sight. I deliberately misjudged my next step. I allowed my right boot to catch heavily on a submerged, uneven paving stone. With a sharp gasp, I pitched forward, collapsing to my hands and knees in the freezing water. The splash was violently loud in the enclosed space. My ankle, I rasped, keeping my face near the water, shivering violently. Vesper stopped. The faint, metallic whisper of her silver stiletto spinning between her fingers paused. "Get up, Beggar. This is not the time to be fragile." "I can't. I need a moment," I choked out, plunging my hands deeper into the muck as if trying to massage my leg. In reality, my fingers were frantically mapping the debris on the floor. I found what I needed. A heavy, jagged chunk of loose masonry, weighing exactly 3 pounds. "We are sitting ducks in this water," Elara hissed, her voice vibrating with residual panic from the vault. "We are fine as long as we keep moving," Vesper replied coldly. "Get him up, Elara." As Elara leaned down, her hands reaching blindly for my shoulder, I shifted my weight. Under the cover of the black water, I launched the 3-pound rock forward with a sharp, lethal flick of my wrist. I threw it exactly parallel to the floor, skimming it just beneath the surface. It traveled 25 feet before colliding heavily with the submerged iron tripwire. The mechanism didn't click. It groaned. A deep, structural vibration shuddered through the granite walls. Vesper's aura instantly flared from slate gray to a blinding, defensive icy blue. "Against the wall," she commanded, her voice slicing through the dark. 30 feet ahead of us, the ceiling tore open. A massive, rusted iron portkey slammed down, the 2-inch thick bars driving deep into the stone floor, completely severing the tunnel. It missed the stalker, dropping exactly where I had calculated it would. But my calculation was incomplete. I had accounted for the gate. I had not accounted for the century-old water main built directly above it. The violent kinetic impact of the dropping gate shattered the compromised masonry holding back the upper aqueduct. A terrifying, concussive roar deafened me. A localized flash flood of freezing, black water exploded from the ceiling, instantly filling the corridor. The water hit me like a solid, moving wall of concrete. The impact ripped me off the floor, tumbling me violently backward. The temperature shock seized my lungs. My plan had failed, and now we were going to drown in the dark. I forced my eyes shut against the rushing grit and engaged my analytical engine. I had to adapt. The current was pushing us backward at roughly 15 feet per second. I mapped the structural anchors of the tunnel walls as I was swept along. 5 feet away, a recessed vertical groove in the left wall. An old maintenance ladder. I didn't fight the water. I let it carry me, angling my body slightly to the left. At exactly the right millisecond, I shot my left arm out, my hand slamming blindly against the granite before my fingers violently locked around a thick, rusted iron rung. The abrupt stop nearly dislocated my shoulder. A heavy body slammed into my side in the rushing dark. "Elara!" She was screaming, a garbled, terrified sound as she swallowed water. I reached out with my right hand into the chaotic, freezing void. I didn't search. I tracked the chaotic violet spike of her panic. My hand clamped flawlessly onto the thick silk collar of her dress. I hauled her inward, pinning her against the wall beside me as the torrent raged past. 10 feet away, Vesper had already secured herself, driving her silver stiletto deeply into a decaying mortar joint and hanging on with terrifying upper body strength. Her icy blue aura flickered as she turned her head toward me. Even in the pitch black, she knew exactly what had just happened. She had felt the water shift. She knew my hand had found Elara perfectly, without fumbling, in the middle of a flash flood. Another anomaly logged in her brilliant, dangerous mind. The intense water pressure lasted for exactly 12 seconds before the ruined walls of the corridor finally gave way. The right side of the tunnel collapsed outward with a deafening crack. The current dumped us violently into a massive, echoing void. We splashed down into a knee-deep pool of stagnant water. The echo of the draining flood bounced off what sounded like a cathedral-sized ceiling. I released Elara, dropping to my knees in the water, coughing violently and hacking up foul-tasting grit. I played the drowning victim perfectly, but my hidden sight was already rapidly mapping our new environment. It was a subterranean cistern. Massive stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling 50 feet above. And we were not alone. I thought the darkness was our biggest enemy down here. I was wrong. The darkness was the only thing keeping us alive. A brilliant, blinding beam of white light suddenly cut through the massive chamber. It was a heavy, military-grade lumen torch, and the beam pinned Kaelen, Elara, and Vesper instantly against the wet stone debris. I squeezed my useless eyes shut, but my hidden sight didn't care about the light. Behind the blinding beam, perched on a ruined stone balcony exactly 20 feet away, I saw the pale yellow aura of the stalker. Calm, lethal, amused. A distinct, heavy metallic clack echoed across the water, the sound of a steel-headed bolt dropping into the firing groove of a repeating crossbow. Drop the stiletto, Vesper, a melodic, mocking voice drifted down from behind the light. Or I will pin your perfect face to that pillar. Vesper froze. Slowly she lowered her arm. Her icy blue aura pulsed with a strange mix of irritation and recognition. Sera, Vesper said coldly. Hello, sisters, the voice replied. The beam of light shifted slightly downward, illuminating the rusted water around us, before locking the central hotspot of the beam directly onto my chest. Now, Sera continued, the tension on her crossbow string vibrating through the ambient air. Why did you bring a rat to my hideout? The blinding beam of the military-grade lumen torch was designed to induce immediate psychological paralysis. It cut through the freezing, damp air of the subterranean cistern like a physical blade, pinning us against the ruined stone wall. Drop the stiletto, Vesper, Sera repeated, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The heavy steel-headed bolt of her repeating crossbow was aimed directly down the shaft of the light. Beside me, Elara was hyperventilating, her violet aura a chaotic mess of pure terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively trying to shrink behind my soaking wet, ragged frame. Vesper did not shrink. Her icy blue aura remained rigid, but she slowly opened her fingers, letting the silver stiletto slip from her grasp. It hit the knee-deep water with a soft plip. There. We are unarmed, Vesper said, her voice projecting calmly across the 20 feet of dark water separating us from the ruined balcony. Now turn the light away from my eyes before you do something mathematically foolish, Sera. I stayed on my knees, coughing up the last of the foul-tasting aqueduct water, playing the completely broken, blind collateral damage. But beneath my lowered head, my hidden sight was dissecting the threat on the balcony with absolute precision. Sera's aura was a pale, glowing yellow. Alert, cynical, but strangely devoid of lethal intent. I tracked the microscopic movements of her musculature, the tension in her forearms, and the exact angle of the crossbow. She was aiming exactly 2 inches to the left of Vesper center mass. It was a deterrence posture. She wasn't preparing to shoot. She was preparing to negotiate. Unarmed is a relative term with you, Vesper, Sera mocked, though she slightly lowered the lumen torch, aiming the blinding hotspot at the water between us. But you didn't answer my question. Why did you drag a blind rat out of the fire? He is the anchor, Vesper replied smoothly, taking a slow, deliberate step forward in the water to put herself slightly ahead of Elara and me. The Blood Tier Pact requires a husband. If he dies before the 100 days, the execution clause activates. Our colors detonate. Sera laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that bounced harshly off the stone pillars. You think the pact matters down here? Sera asked. You think my father or Elara's father cares about the technicalities of the old magic? They dumped us in a designated kill zone. The rules are already broken. I thought the trap in the aqueduct proved that, Vesper noted coldly. Your dropgate almost drowned us. The pale yellow of Sera's aura suddenly flickered, spiked with a sharp, brilliant flash of silver genuine, undeniable surprise. Sera lowered the crossbow entirely. I didn't drop the gate, she said. The mocking tone vanished from her voice, replaced by a sudden, heavy gravity. I was hiding in the upper junction because I was running from whoever did. Everything that happened next was because of that one terrible clarification. The hierarchy of predators in Fox Alley hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. If you didn't rig the tripwire, Vesper murmured, her slate-gray aura of absolute caution returning instantly, then who was standing in the corridor behind us? Look to your left, Vesper, Sera instructed quietly. She swept the heavy beam of the lumen torch across the massive cistern, illuminating a raised concrete platform roughly 40 feet away. I didn't need the light to see it. My mind's eye had already registered the rapidly decaying thermal signatures pooled on the stone. Lying in a tangled heap on the platform were 3 bodies. They wore the heavy boiled leather armor of the Capitol Guards, the men who had supposedly escorted us to the ruined temple. But they hadn't just been killed. They had been systematically dismantled. The 4th wife, Sera whispered into the echoing dark. I don't know her name. I don't know what highborn family she supposedly belongs to. But she isn't a disgraced noblewoman. I watched her drop from the ceiling of the guardhouse an hour ago and butcher those 3 men in less than 6 seconds without making a single sound. Elara let out a choked, terrified sob. The rapid click-click of her thumbnail against her index finger started again, vibrating frantically. She followed you down the aqueduct, Sera continued, her heart rate finally beginning to elevate. She dropped the gate to flush you out. She's hurting us. My analytical engine hit a wall of pure ice. If the 4th wife was an elite, silent assassin capable of dropping 3 armed guards in seconds, she wouldn't have just flushed us into an open room to let us chat. She would use the distraction. She would use the blinding light of the lumen torch, which was completely ruining Sera and Vesper's night vision. I abandoned my echolocation of intent on the floor level. I threw my perception straight up, scanning the massive, 50-foot vaulted ceiling directly above Sera's balcony. A massive, terrifying anomaly painted my mind. It wasn't an aura. It was a void, a sphere of absolute, freezing blackness that absorbed all ambient heat, clinging effortlessly to the slick, moss-covered stalactites directly above Sera's head. It had no heartbeat. It had no respiratory signature. But it was moving. It was descending. Sera, I didn't whisper. I didn't shout. I projected my voice with a flat, dead calm that cut through the panic of the room like a scalpel. Turn the light off. Sera flinched at the sound of my voice. What did the beggar just drip? A single, thick drop of warm liquid hit the stone edge of the balcony exactly 1 inch from the toe of Sera's boot. In my hidden sight, it flared with a bright, dying crimson. Fresh blood. Sera froze. Slowly, agonizingly, she tilted her head upward into the pitch black above her. The sphere of absolute, freezing void detached from the ceiling. It dropped silently through the air, completely bypassing the beam of the lumen torch, landing softly onto the balcony directly behind Sera. I saw the glint of a curved, non-reflective blade rising toward Sera's neck. She's here, I said into the dark.